Well, it's been quite a few years since we've seen a team performance, such a dominant performance, be so dramatic. The 2024 Hungarian Grand Prix, on the face of it, will be remembered for a brilliant McLaren 1-2 finish, their first since Monza 2021. But behind it was another questionable showing from the team's pit wall, as Lando Norris was asked to pull over so that Oscar Piastri could take the lead with just 2 laps left to go, leaving Oscar Piastri to take his first Grand Prix victory. Before we get into the analysis of the race, let's do a little race rundown on the results. It was Oscar Piastri in first, ahead of Lando Norris for McLaren's 1-2, just ahead of Lewis Hamilton for Mercedes in third. Charles Leclerc came fourth for Ferrari, with Max Verstappen coming home in fifth. The second Ferrari of Carlos Sainz in sixth, and the second Red Bull of Sergio Perez in seventh. George Russell came home eighth for Mercedes, with Yuki Tsunoda ninth for RB, and Lance Stroll coming in 10th for Aston Martin. My name is Steph Wentworth, and joining me to run down all things Hungarian GP, we have JVL and Stuart Codling. How are we doing, lads?
Had a very pleasant motorcycle ride in this morning once I'd vacuumed the spider colony out of the exhaust. That's the great British summer for you.
Absolutely.
And I've had a great morning, thank you. I've been busy putting spider colonies in Codders' motorbike, so took a little bit of transport, but we got there, got back in time, so all good.
Got there. Well, I think we just get straight into it because there's much to talk about following on from that race. I think we start with McLaren and their 1-2 finish. They really kind of dominated that race, beating Lewis Hamilton to third by double digits. Is this enough to think that they're the team to beat? You know, they have had a few strong races where they've been in the potential and been in the running to take victories. Are they top dog in F1 right now?
Well, if you start off by saying, do they have the best car? Arguably, over the past few races, on balance, pretty much they have over the various conditions. Whether the race operations are quite up there to maximise the use of the best car, bit tricky to say, really, isn't it? Because we've had a few controversies. On the other hand, I think the events of Hungary show that they are now in a position to be perhaps a little bit more ruthless in terms of stage management. But even that didn't end well for them, did it?
Yeah, well, JBL, let's talk about the strategy call. Let's talk about the big talking point, really. Lando Norris ended up undercutting Piastri during the final round of pit stops for the lead of the race. There's a lot of discourse about this, but were McLaren right in doing that? Their reasoning was they wanted to cover off Lewis Hamilton behind, but that ended up switching the two McLarens and caused the controversy that ended up spilling out over team radio.
I think you can cut it two ways. You can say that they were right to do it and they weren't right to do it. I think the reason that I can certainly understand is why they were justified to do it was because, especially in the context of the last few races, they've thrown away a lot of results. Possibly should have had a win in Canada. Probably should have had a win in Austria. That's not really them throwing it away as such. And probably could have had a win at Silverstone. So you've got to break that run at some point. And McLaren, obviously, perhaps it felt it had taken too many risks with things over the preceding races. So it wanted to play it super conservative. And so if that means lock down the result and then worry about the position later, that's probably what they were going for. So obviously Hamilton was coming up behind Norris. He performed that undercut strategy really, really well. That's the thing that got him ahead of Max Verstappen. So that's something to consider. And if you're looking at the final margins, eventually it probably wasn't actually worth covering off. But in the context of the time, when you're looking at it from how the team was calling the decisions at that time, it seemed like the prudent thing to do. And, you know, obviously accounting for losses in the pit stop, anything else like that, traffic on your outlap, that kind of thing. So it kind of made sense to do it. But equally, they would have been able to pit Piastri first, I think. I think if you look at overall that strategy, Piastri would have come out ahead and then would have been able to sort of get a little bit of time on Norris with the fresher tyres, and it wouldn't have been the faff that it was. But I think it was result first, order second for them rather than going the other way around. And I think when they've got a little bit more strategic latitude to do positions first, then result, then okay, maybe they would have done it the other way. But I think ultimately it was just about getting the result done and dusted. And that was the main thing. Worry about the switch later. I mean, they could have done it on the last lap if they really wanted to.
It's very easy to review a race and look at everything that happened and know everything and to make judgments about whatever the quality of decision making, and you can really sort of play shoulda, woulda, coulda in the immortal words of Beverly Knight. But actually, you can only judge the quality of decisions based on what a team knew at the time. And there's quite a lot of factors in play during that race. I think, firstly, something we really ought to address in this video is that overtaking's got harder again at the Hungaroring. We kind of, I know musically speaking in the pop world, we're going back to the 80s nowadays, and here we are again, the Hungaroring being a little bit like the 80s, shades of Thierry boots and keeping Ayrton Senna behind him all race to score that win about 35 years ago. Despite the Hungaroring now seemingly having a DRS zone for every day of the week and one for Sunday best, you just can't pass on it. And so that just makes teams not want to give up track position. And as we saw later in the race with a few optimistic moves, particularly Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton, a little bit of desperation creeping in. Add onto that higher than expected tyre degradation, all those people who started on soft tyres instantly regretting it and pitting within a handful of laps. That sort of introduces a lot of unknowns. And I think that's why, when you look at the decisions McLaren made, you sort of think, oh, well, you could have just pitted Piastri first and it would be fine. But actually at the time, they were managing all those variables. Lewis Hamilton creeping up on Lando, Max Verstappen clearly, despite all his protestations on the radio, Red Bull trying to build a tyre offset for him so he'd be strong at the end. So you could see why McLaren, after all these little misfires, wanted to preserve their 1-2, because we've all sat and watched The Weakest Link where the contestants are on a run and they've got a few £100 in the bank and you're saying, bank it, you fool, bank it, and then the next contestant fluffs a really easy question. So with all that in mind, you can understand McLaren wanting to take hold of their 1-2 and think, oh, we can persuade the drivers to move later. But then of course that introduces an element of driver psychology, and perhaps they were forgetting that the last time a very talented driver in with a shout at the championship gave up their chances for a teammate, it was Peter Collins in 1956. So before a lot of us were born.
I think before all of us were born. Definitely the three of us. I know I wasn't there. But Connors, while we're on that topic of driver psychology, McLaren did ask Lando Norris, obviously, to move over once that cycle of pit stops was complete. His engineer, Will Joseph, was becoming more and more frustrated and really trying to get him to make that move. And Lando was saying, Oscar needs to catch up, Oscar needs to close the gap, etc., etc. It was about 2 laps to go in the end when the move was finally done. Was this kind of a missed opportunity from Lando Norris's behalf? Because obviously the team are looking at it from the team perspective with the 1-2, but Lando is in this fight for the championship at the front of the grid. Was it a missed opportunity to show a bit of ruthlessness?
Yes and no. As JBL says, you can cut it both ways, can't you? Mathematically, it made sense for him to keep the win because he's on 189 points. Max is on 265. Every point counts. He's already left a few on the shelf. On the other hand, there is that question of managing the relationships within the team, and I kind of think back to, if you remember, the famous team orders fiasco with Ferrari, where Felipe Massa was told to move over, but in code. So Rob Smedley on the radio saying, Fernando is faster than you. Apparently, Rob Smedley came to the Autosport show a few years ago and he revealed that what was actually happening there was Fernando was saying, make him slow down, I'll need to pass. And they said, well, you need to speed up, sunshine. And so Fernando sped up a bit and Felipe sped up a bit, and this carried on, and they were both pushing and pushing and pushing until eventually they had to get on the radio and say, stop it now, Fernando is faster than you. And this was almost exactly the same scenario that was playing out at the Hungaroring, where Lando was being told to save your tyres in certain corners because you're pushing them too hard. And certainly nowadays, saving tyres is much more important than it was 15 years ago.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've exhausted the whole McLaren situation. Let's look a bit further down the field. JBL, it was quite a frustrating day in the Red Bull camp. Max Verstappen was quite irate on the radio, questioning the handling of his Red Bull and obviously all the decisions that was going on in the race. He clattered into Lewis Hamilton in that fight for third position. Was Verstappen justified in his anger, or do you think maybe the events of the opening lap when he was pushed wide, could that have contributed to his overall mental state throughout the race?
I just think he was in a foul mood all day, to be honest.
The most of them were, to be fair.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll touch on that in a bit, because it seemed like absolutely nobody except maybe 2 or 3 drivers were actually happy with their strategies. But we'll cover that in a bit. But with regards to Max, I think that probably the first corner incident probably did put him in a little bit of a mood, because he sensed that the team wasn't going to necessarily fight his corner, and obviously, it's done so many times for him in the past, and they kind of thought, well, actually, we don't really have a leg to stand on here, because Piastri was at a certain place, Norris couldn't really go anywhere, so therefore, Verstappen was just going to end off the road. It's not like he was pushed off, it's not like Norris forced him into that position. So ultimately, Max gave the place back. I think that did rile him a little bit. I think not having the pace relative to the McLarens riled him a little bit. I think seeing Lewis Hamilton get closer and closer riled him a little bit as well. I just think it's getting very hot, very bothered, and just very upset by the way the race was going. And I think, and Codders has already touched on this actually, the strategy from Red Bull was extend that first stint as long as possible, and then make sure it's got the tyres at the end of the stints to go and get after people. And I think he was only really looking at it from a very short-termist point of view, in that he saw that he was behind Hamilton after the first stop, and he was like, well, this strategy's let me down. Well, no, because Hamilton was always going to undercut you, and if you were going to try and pit ahead of him, then it wouldn't have suited you very well. So it's ultimately be patient, go and get after him later when he's cooked his tyres. And that was the case during the second stint as well. And instead, Max went hell for leather on the tyres, took every inch of life out of them, and then by the time that he was battling with Hamilton, he didn't really have a lot left to fight with, and so he got a little bit desperate, and the move ended up being the move, or not. So it was very, very difficult for Verstappen to kind of get his head around. It was like he had decided that it wasn't a good strategy, so he was going to try and make up for it, when that's exactly not what he needed to do. He needed to be patient, hang it out, wait for Hamilton and Leclerc ahead to ruin their tyres, and he got by Leclerc pretty quickly, but wait for Hamilton to run out, and then go and get him, and then potentially go and get after Norris afterwards. I think P2 would have been a little bit of a tough ask, but he would have got closer than he did effectively. So I think he was in a really poor mood, and it genuinely affected his driving, I think.
Codders, I'm interested to hear your side of things as well, because Max was very justified in his frustration to a certain extent, from his frustrations with the strategy and his frustrations with Stuart in calls, but he wasn't holding back kind of in the post-race interviews when we saw him kind of lay into the team a little bit, and he was unhappy with the strategy. He is fighting for this championship, and as McLaren get closer and as there is more pressure on them, pressure builds, pressure mounts. Is he feeling the effects of that pressure?
Well, it certainly looked like it, didn't it? I mean, I don't know if Red Bull have a swear box, but he'll certainly be having to shovel a few euros into it after this race. And yeah, it was quite tetchy. There was speculation from one TV commentator. He went on about it so much, I thought it was like a hill he was going to die on. But in actual fact, this whole business of whether he was sleep deprived because he'd been up playing video games is a little bit of a nonsense and a non-starter from my point of view, because we were all young once, we could stay up late and it wasn't a problem. I don't think sleep deprivation's the issue here. You could sort of say perhaps spending a little bit too much time playing video games points to a wider problem, but let's set it aside for now. I think a lot of the tetchiness just comes from circumstance. You have people who living in each other's pockets for so long now. We've had a triple header, then a small gap, and now a double header. you see it in the music biz. You have bands that start out together when they're kids and it's great and they're all friends, and then once they've been on the road together for a few months, they all hate one another. So either gets like Fleetwood Mac and epic wife swapping ensues, or they end up like One Direction and they're all traveling home in separate private jets because they're not talking to one another anymore. So I think that's probably a little bit more of what was going on here. And you could see even Giampiero Lambiase was getting a little bit saying, it's a bit childish, Max. It's about as tetchy as GP gets. And even he was getting a little bit fed up with it. But I think a lot of it was, as JBL says, it was to do with the way the race was working out. After 2 seasons of such dominance and having the best car and every race being, if not easy, certainly straightforward, here he is. They've added an update package, quite a major change to the way the engine's cooled for aerodynamic purposes. And on the face of it, maybe it wasn't working brilliantly. It looks as if Red Bull, in trying to add performance to the car, have made the car a little bit more tricky to set up and find the sweet spot in. And part of the reason they were so dominant over the past couple of years has been that the car's been quite benign over a number of states. Now it needs to be stiff. It doesn't take curbs well. It doesn't like bumps. So it was never really going to work very well at a circuit like the Hungaroring. And if you look at one of the very few non-expletive-laden radio communications, GP and Max were discussing whether he needed to go up a little on front wing at one of the pit stops. And Max went, oh, well, it would help a bit, but then it'd ruin my tyre, so don't bother. And that was also pointing towards the fact that at the Hungaroring, they have to set up the cars with understeer to protect the rear tyres, and that's the state of car Max hates most. So put all that together, living in each other's pockets for so long, a bit of frustration because race results haven't been coming to him, a circuit where his car was handling like a pig and no prospect of it improving, him not liking the strategy. All of a sudden, Mardy Bum pops out. If he wins in Belgium, he'll be as happy as, a pig in a poke.
Well, we'll have to wait and see. But on the other side of the Red Bull garage, let's talk about that. Checo Perez crashed out again in Q1. It's his 4th exit in the first round of qualifying in the last 6 races, which is quite incredible to say. He recovered to finish 7th in the race, but there's a lot of pressure on the team to potentially release him early with the lack of performance that he's been showing. What are the team's moves from here? Has he done enough to secure that seat? And in reality, who's potentially replacing him? JBL, let's go with you. There's a lot of options.
So first of all, I just want to sort of touch on his race, because actually he had a really good afternoon on Sunday. There was promise in FP2 where Perez was 4th quickest. Actually, a bit of promise in FP1 as well, but he sort of slid down the order because he didn't do a competitive time at the end. But it looked genuinely very good in practice, and then Q1 just rain started to fall, and I think it's just sort of like symptomatic of his luck, really. I mean, obviously in Formula 1 you do make your own luck, and I think he's not made enough of it. But this time I think it was genuinely, it was a mistake, but it was relatively innocuous. Just slipped on the curb, went into the wall, was pushing far too hard on that lap when the rain was starting to sort of intensify a little bit. I think backing out of it and making sure that you go again when the conditions are getting a little bit better. That's probably the way forward. It's always really, really hard to judge. But I just kind of want to talk about, Perez's race, because doing that stint on the hard tyre, sort of looking at his traces now, really, really good laps from him throughout that stint. Sort of got onto a par, I would say, with Verstappen's times on the medium towards the end of that stint. Extending that stint really, really well. He's getting stuck behind Bottas, getting stuck behind Russell, and it's so difficult to overtake at Hungary. So it did make his afternoon a little bit more difficult. But once Bottas got out of the way, the pace could sort of come up a little bit, and then Perez and Red Bull decided, okay, what we'll do is we'll undercut Russell and go on to the medium tyre pace was really, really strong in that stint, actually. I think it's fair to say. And that ensured that he was able to undercut Russell. That made sure that he was able to just go after it and basically sort of try and catch up to Sainz. Didn't quite get there. I think obviously starting P16, it's not going to help you at Hungary. So yeah, Perez put together a really, really solid race. Did come under a little bit of pressure from Russell towards the end of his second medium stint. There was a little bit of drop off in the second half, tyre wise, but then Russell started to hit the peak of what he could manage. His tyres dropped off even more, so Perez was able to keep the place. So ultimately, it was just this was basically what Max should have done, really. This was a good understanding of what the big picture was. I think he had an aim in mind and he had a target, and he knew basically what he needed to do to get there. Whereas Max was sort of seeing somebody in front of him and going, how did they end up there? Oh, this shouldn't happen. It's like, no, just let it come to you. It's okay. Perez saw someone in front of him, went, we'll undercome. It's fine. Don't worry about it. So I thought it was a really, really solid race. Probably could have been a lot more if he hadn't shoved it into the wall in Q1.
Yeah, this was the race where, or the venue rather, where Pierre Gasly torpedoed his Red Bull career, or certainly delivered the final bullet when he sort of failed in qualifying and he enabled the Mercedes to play games with Max during the whole course of the race. And at that point, Red Bull was still sort of trying to take Max on that trajectory to becoming world champion for the first time. Now he's a triple world champion and he needs a teammate who can stop the challenger drivers scoring, especially at this sort of phase of the season where Max is struggling to convert performance into wins. And also, when you look at there's now 51 points between McLaren and Red Bull in the Constructors' Championship. If McLaren were to usurp Red Bull at the head of the Constructors' Championship, that would be not just a remarkable turnaround, it would be really costly for Red Bull. So for all those reasons, they need a driver who's up there with Max, playing that backstop role, stopping the McLarens from scoring or reducing their opportunities to score. And he's not going to be able to do that when you need to borrow Lord Nelson's telescope to see where he is at the back of the grid.
It's getting savage. Okay. I don't quite know how to respond to that. Who are the potential replacements if we are talking about Sergio Perez potentially losing that seat? Obviously, Red Bull have quite the extensive junior driver academy. In that RB seat at the minute, we've got Daniel Ricciardo and Yuki Tsunoda. There's also Liam Lawson, who stepped in for a few races last year. Who can we tee up potentially?
If we're looking at the options that are being touted, those three obviously are the main ones. There's put Liam Lawson into the car, and obviously he's had the test in the RB20 now. It's not been particularly, as far as word goes, it's not been a particularly strong turn in that car. It was fine, I think, but probably not what Red Bull needed. With regards to Tsunoda, I think, personally speaking, I think he's the strongest option. I think he's earned a shot there. As far as I understand, Christian Horner, however, doesn't really rate him enough to put him in one of his cars. And Daniel Ricciardo is basically, he would be the firm option if he was performing well. And he's been performing better lately, but he's probably not performing well enough for a step that you kind of think, okay, he's a much better option than Perez, and we'll put him in. So as far as I'm concerned, I genuinely don't believe Perez is getting replaced this season. And I think it's probably a reason of convenience. I don't think there's an option that A, Red Bull rates particularly, and B, that they could put in that car and it would immediately do a better job unless they splashed the cash and got somebody else in. And the option who I do think would be good enough to push things forward isn't going to be the option that Red Bull will put on the car, which is Tsunoda. So I think Perez stays for the end of the season, certainly, and Red Bull will reassess for next season, see if Sainz is available, see who is available, but unfortunately, options are dwindling at the moment.
Coddish, you're nodding along there.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. I know that's a bit makes for boring video, but just little nuances here and there that you pick up. For instance, in Silverstone, when Perez binned it in Q1 and the cameras then cut to Christian Horner on the pit wall, and obviously there's a tiny amount of delay between the cut happening and then seeing it on their monitors on the pit wall. So it took precisely the length of that cut for him to sort of twig that he was on, and he sort of theatrically put his head in his hands. Fast forward a couple of weeks to more or less the same thing happening in the Hungaroring, and he's almost like the Dalai Lama practicing transcendental meditation when the camera cuts to him. There's none of this sort of, oh, woe is me, what's that idiot done now? And that sort of tells me that somewhere along the line a decision's been made that they're going to stop putting that perform or fire pressure on Perez, and that they've realised that probably there's no more credible people who they could slot in right now.
Right, let's move away from Red Bull. We've given them plenty of attention. Let's talk about Leclerc, because he had a decent race, actually, but the Ferrari are just very in the middle of nowhere. They're almost in their own race, but Leclerc managed to kind of get into that fight with Verstappen and Hamilton during the Hungarian Grand Prix. Is this following a trend, kind of Ferrari being a bit forgettable, or is it circuit specific because they've had a few back-to-back weekends where it's been a little bit difficult? JVR?
Ferrari's had a few problems with upgrades. That's the main crux of it. And it's kind of Imola that brought performance for that race kind of a Monaco. But what it did was it exacerbated something in the chassis that ensures that when the car's going through a high-speed corner, it quite likes to bounce, basically how the cars were doing a couple of years ago. So they were like, okay, that's not a great trait, but we can mitigate that with setup, and we can do these sorts of things. Bring a new floor to Barcelona, it'll probably all be fine. Bring a new floor to Barcelona, and it's even worse. And they're going through your turn 3, you're going through the final couple of corners around the circuit, and the car's bouncing like a space hopper, basically. So that's why they eventually rolled back on the floor for Silverstone, just to make sure that it wasn't going to do that through cops, through Stowe, through corners like that. So a new floor for this weekend has sort of been part of, again, a challenge to try and fix that. And obviously Spa will be the main test of that, because that's much more high-speed corner. There's more of a proliferation of those compared to Hungary, which is generally slow-medium. So that's kind of the main crux of the problem there. McLaren and Mercedes have improved a lot more than Ferrari has. But equally, Ferrari got his strategy pretty much spot on at Hungary. Leclerc did the strategy that Verstappen probably should have done, or took the view of it that Verstappen should have done, which is go really, really long on the first set of tyres. Keep it going for as long as possible. And then in the middle stint, basically try and be as flexible as you can with it. And so, yeah, he did short stop in his hard tyres, so that made Leclerc's final stint a lot more difficult. But he followed Hamilton right in to the pit lane. And I think he was helped by Hamilton and Verstappen sort of fighting ahead of him, just slowly went about his business and made up time and got to the back of them. But that gave him the opportunity then. When Hamilton pitted, he pounced, and then he ended up ahead of Verstappen on the undercut. Yeah, sure, he was overtaken, but when Verstappen, went way too deep into turn 1 and ended up colliding with Hamilton, that gave Leclerc 4th. So I think he got absolutely the maximum out of that car today. He's had a bad run, Charles Leclerc, and he's not been able to quite get the same out of the car as Sainz has done. I think he's a little bit more sensitive to the, let's say, less fortuitous aspects of the car. But yeah, he's done a really good job. Ferrari's just sort of, it's fallen back a little bit. It knows that it needs upgrades. It knows that it needs a little bit more push forward, and it hopes it can do that after the summer break. But ultimately, when you get what you're given as a driver, you've got to work with it. And I think largely both Ferrari drivers did that Sunday, to be honest. Yeah,
a little bit of frustration at Ferrari, but frustration up and down the grid, really. As we touched on it a little bit before, we had some very angry drivers all through the field. We had Alonso, who was a little bit frustrated with the team order situation at Aston Martin. Ricciardo was unhappy with the strategy, as were many drivers. What on earth was going on in Hungary?
Well, stroppiness, isn't it? All these people living in each other's pockets. Well, I suppose, Fernando probably wasn't looking forward to the Monday Lawrence Stroll hairdryer job that apparently is a fixture of Mondays at the Aston Martin factory when it's all not going right. Daniel Ricciardo, I kind of wonder what was going on in his head. He said that the call to pit that annoys him in retrospect came straight out of the blue, and he didn't have time to say, well, actually, no, that's a terrible idea. He said he just heard box, box, box. So in he went. And that was when Alex Albon and Kevin Magnussen, who'd got ahead of him on the soft tyres, pitted on lap 6. And the team kind of panicked and brought him as well. And what he should have done at that point was plug in his Carlos Sainz head and say, oh, no, I'm not doing that. You lot can go fish. I'm going to carry on going. But instead, he pitted and he said as soon as he came into the pit lane, he knew it was a terrible idea. And we're back in shoulda, woulda, coulda territory, aren't we? A driver with his experience should have said, no, just let them go. They've made the mistake. Let's capitalise on that. So he was right to be angry, but he should be angry with himself for not seeing it and reacting and saying no to the team.
JBL, what about the Alonso Stroll situation? What do you make of that?
I'm equally as baffled because I don't know why. I understand the risk if you're starting well back, start on the soft tyre, try and make a few places up the field, and then pit and basically see what you've got later. I don't really understand why starting 7th and 8th you would take that risk. If you are Aston Martin and you're finding 7th, 8th positions a little bit more difficult to come by in recent races, I don't understand why you would risk that and go on a strategy that, let's be honest, they probably thought they were being a little bit clever by doing it, but why they would be so convinced that that was the right idea to put both cars on it when no one else did that. They maybe hedged their bets with one car and put another car on a more conventional strategy. And so I don't really understand it. And so it got to the point that actually Stroll did a really good job in keeping the life in his softs to go a little bit longer. But Alonso was compromised from the start, and he made up a place at the start, place or two. Then he was started dropping back again because the softs obviously couldn't handle the conditions. It's too hot, circuit's a little bit, the weather's a little bit high. So then he ends up pitting, and ends up in this midfield DRS train, and he's trying to back everybody up because he's trying to create a space for Stroll to go and pit. So basically, his race was pretty compromised, and he was just nothing more than a sort of blocker, a buffer, a barrier to everybody else. So I don't really understand. It's not a winning strategy, is it? It's let's try and hold on to 10th, or I don't know. It just lacked ambition, I think, or had too much ambition at the start and then lacked ambition later. And Stroll, actually, to be fair to him, he did make it work. He did get in the gap that Alonso created, and then he was pushing Tsunoda at the end of the race, and didn't have the time to get past him, but he probably would have had the tyres to do it because Tsunoda was on a one-stopper, which was equally the thing that Ricciardo had umbrage about because he wanted the same strategy and he'd seen what his teammate could do with it. So a lot of weird strategies going on. A lot of people, obviously you had Albon and Magnussen pitting early. A lot of people responded to that, and I don't really understand why, because they were going to have to go so long throughout their next two stints, and I think surely they would have seen, even in FP2 where the conditions were probably the most similar to the race, they would have seen that Deg was high, so you don't want to be 3 stopping or going excessively long unless you're confident that you can do it. So yeah, it was a weird afternoon.
Absolutely. So as we can all agree, I think lots of lessons to be learnt from the Hungarian Grand Prix. But it's not long before we head to Belgium for the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa-Francorchamps, one of the best circuits on the calendar. Can we see these tantrums continuing? What can we expect from this weekend? Red Bull back at the top?
Don't rule it out. There's less curb riding. Hopefully everyone in Formula One will have spent a couple of days out, having some nice meditative retreat and be happy to be with one another for one final weekend before the summer break. In terms of circuit characteristics, Red Bull have been great here the past few years. It's a circuit. It's very peculiar. You have two sectors where it's always been a power circuit, another one where you need downforce. So it's a track that requires compromises in terms of setup. And then, of course, you have, I'm going to activate cliche mode and talk about the fickle weather of the Ardennes that can play a role as well. So that can also play into differing car characteristics. You know, look at Silverstone and the way the balance between the Mercedes and the McLaren shifted as it got a little bit wet and then got drier again and then got wet again. We might just see a little bit of that, the advantage shifting over the course of the weekend and maybe in the race itself.
JVR, what do you make of this weekend?
See, I think, first of all, and Codders has already kind of touched upon this, we've had a lot of races. It's the end of July now, and we've basically got what we would consider a full season in the 80s or most of a full season in the 90s. Like, we've had 14 of races already. It's no surprise that people are getting tetchy with strategy and that kind of thing, because they've just, for the best part of 6 months, have been sort of stuck together in, I guess, one big happy family. But honestly, yeah, I think it feels like it's going to be a little bit more Red Bull this weekend, just because of the nature of the circuit, high speed corners. As Colin already said, not as much curb riding. It's always been a circuit that Red Bull was suited. It's always been the circuit that if Max Verstappen's needed to take an engine penalty, then they've taken it there because they know that he can just get through the field. He's done that in the last 2 seasons. I don't think they're going to necessarily have the same advantage, and you should expect McLaren to be a little bit stronger. Cooler conditions, Mercedes should be sort of there or thereabouts. If Ferrari's fixed its bouncing problem in the high speed, they could also be a factor as well. So I think it's still sort of open. I think form would suggest Red Bull, but I think it's still open season, sort of generally speaking. So I'm not willing to. I'm willing to sit on the fence for now, as usual.
Well, I think we'll bring this to a conclusion. Thank you so much for your time, gentlemen. But before we head out, let's have a look at how the championship looks ahead of the Belgian Grand Prix. Lando Norris eked into Max Verstappen's championship lead after this weekend and is in second behind Max Verstappen. Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz in third and fourth, with Oscar Piastri in fifth and Lewis Hamilton in sixth. The Red Bull of Sergio Perez is in seventh, and the second Mercedes, George Russell, in eighth. Both of the Aston Martins round out the top 10, with Fernando Alonso in ninth and Lance Stroll in 10th. Further down the field, we have Nico Hülkenberg and Yuki Tsunoda in 11th and 12th, Daniel Ricciardo in 13th, Ollie Behrman still in the mix there in 14th, with Pierre Gasly, Kevin Magnussen, Alex Albon and Esteban Ocon rounding out the points scorers. Looking at the team's championship, it is Red Bull Racing still up out front, with McLaren closing in on them in second. Ferrari and Mercedes not too far behind in third and fourth, with Aston Martin in fifth. RB and Haas are 6th and 7th, with Alpine in 8th, Williams in 9th and Sauber in 10th yet to score. But I think that'll just about do it for our Hungarian Grand Prix analysis. Let us know what you think about all the McLaren drama in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed this video, leave it a like and subscribe so you don't miss any of the Autosport content. We'll be back next week with a rundown of the Belgian Grand Prix ahead of the summer break. But until then, thanks for watching.